Nestled in the serene hills of Birmingham, Alabama, a woman held the gavel with the authority that came from decades of legal prowess. Judge Marcia Taylor was more than a pillar of the community. She was its paragon of justice. Her sharp intellect, commanding presence, and an unblemished career had earned her the admiration of colleagues and citizens alike. But behind the oak-paneled courtroom and the dignified black robes lay a private life fraught with secrets. She wanted a marriage. She forbade it. Marcia's marriage to Detective Caleb Hargrove had long been considered a union of mutual respect and ambition. Caleb, a decorated police officer, was no stranger to the pressures of public service. Together, they embodied the quintessential power couple, a symbol of integrity in a world marred by corruption. Their sprawling suburban home hosted barbecues for fellow officers and charity fundraisers for underprivileged children. On the surface, theirs was a life most envied. But beneath the veneer of domestic harmony, fissures had begun to form. At first, Marcia dismissed it as fan mail, the kind of praise judges sometimes received from those who appreciated their judgments. But the letters kept coming, their tone shifting from admiration to something more personal, more intimate. The sender, one Michael Grayson, was no ordinary admirer. He was an inmate in Alabama State Penitentiary, serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery and aggravated assault. His letters spoke of redemption, of faith, and a yearning for connection. For reasons Marcia couldn't entirely articulate, she began to respond. At first, she framed her replies as professional outreach, encouragement to a man trying to turn his life around. But the correspondence quickly deepened. Michael had a way with words, weaving poetic descriptions of loneliness and hope that tugged at Marcia's heartstrings. As the weeks turned into months, their exchanges became the highlight of her day. By the time they spoke on the phone for the first time, her voice quivering with both fear and exhilaration, Marcia realized she was in uncharted territory. Michael was everything Caleb wasn't: passionate, attentive, and utterly dependent on her. Their calls became more frequent, their content more explicit. Marcia found herself sneaking away during court recesses, locking her office door, and clutching her phone like a lifeline. The thrill of secrecy intoxicated her. Still, she maintained her role as the esteemed Judge Taylor. In the courtroom, her judgments were swift and incisive. Her colleagues marveled at her composure, her ability to balance compassion with the rigidity of the law. The judge was the only one to utter the words of pronouncement, and the truth never went unhunted. Outside the courthouse, she continued to host fundraisers with Caleb by her side, their hands clasped in a display of marital unity. But Marcia's duplicity began to take its toll. She grew paranoid, scanning her surroundings for signs that someone might have uncovered her secret. Caleb, preoccupied with a string of unsolved homicides, paid little attention to her late nights or the occasional unexplained absence. If he suspected anything, he never said. The turning point came during one of Michael's calls. His voice, usually smooth and comforting, was tinged with desperation. He confessed that his parole hearing had been denied, and he faced several more years behind bars. The thought of their burgeoning romance being confined to letters and clandestine calls drove him to despair. He needed freedom, not just for himself, but for them. Marcia was torn. As a judge, she had sworn an oath to uphold the law, but as a woman, she was deeply entangled in emotions she could no longer suppress. She began to entertain thoughts that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. What if there was a way to free Michael, to liberate both of them from their respective cages? The solution presented itself one night as Marcia lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her master bedroom. Caleb's soft snores filled the room, a reminder of the man she had once loved and now barely tolerated. Michael had become her obsession, her salvation. And Caleb? He was the obstacle standing in the way of her happiness. Marcia's mind spiraled as she toyed with an idea so dangerous it sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't just about leaving Caleb. Divorce would be too messy, too public. No, she needed a clean break, one that would ensure Caleb was out of the picture permanently. And Michael, with his prison connections and a willingness to do anything for her, seemed to hold the answer. By dawn, Marcia had made her decision. She would reach out to Michael and propose a plan that would shock even her: the hiring of a hitman to eliminate Caleb. It was a line she never thought she'd cross, a descent into darkness that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. The first step was gauging Michael's reaction. Over their next call, Marcia broached the topic delicately, framing it as a hypothetical. "If there was a way for us to be together, really together, would you take it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael's response was immediate and resolute. "I'd do anything for you, Marcia. Anything." Emboldened by his words, Marcia outlined her plan. Michael listened intently, offering suggestions and promising to connect her with someone who could get the job done. Despite the gravity of their conversation, Marcia felt a perverse sense of relief. For the first time in months, she saw a way forward, a path that led to freedom and love, no matter how steeped in blood it might be. As the sun rose over Birmingham, Judge Marcia Taylor emerged from her bedroom, her face a mask of calm determination. To the world, she was still the respected arbiter of justice, the devoted wife of a police officer. But inside, she had become something entirely different. A woman willing to sacrifice everything for passion, even if it meant stepping into the abyss. To understand the depths of betrayal, one must first grasp the loneliness that brewed in Marcia Taylor's marriage. Her union with Caleb had once been a passionate affair, a whirlwind romance that defied their rigorous professions. But time, as it often does, eroded the foundations of their relationship. Caleb's unwavering dedication to his job as a detective meant late nights and endless calls. For Marcia, the very qualities that had drawn her to him, his sense of justice, his commitment to duty, became the source of her resentment. She felt invisible in her own home. Dinners were often cold by the time Caleb returned, his face marked with exhaustion and worry from the streets. Caleb discovered that they were eating the same thing. The stories he once shared with her about his cases now seemed too dark, too grim, as if he were protecting her from the world he inhabited. In reality, Caleb was merely retreating further into himself. And Marcia, left to navigate her loneliness, began to drift. The letters from Michael Grayson became her lifeline. At first, she told herself that responding to a prisoner was a charitable act, a way to fulfill her duties as a compassionate judge. Michael's words were eloquent, his perspective raw and unfiltered. In his letters, he wrote about the isolation of prison life, the regret that consumed him, and his dreams of a better future. His vulnerability struck a chord in Marcia, awakening feelings she hadn't experienced in years. Their correspondence escalated quickly. What began as brief, platonic notes evolved into lengthy exchanges filled with shared dreams and stolen moments of joy. Their solar moments, Michael, in his unique way, had become her confidant. He understood her struggles with Caleb in a way no one else could. From his cell, he painted a vivid picture of the life they could have together, one free from judgment and societal constraints. For Michael, Marcia was a beacon of hope. Her words offered a reprieve from the monotony of prison life. In her, he saw salvation, a chance to reclaim his humanity. It wasn't long before he began to push the boundaries of their relationship, weaving subtle romantic undertones into his letters. Marcia, despite her initial hesitations, found herself eagerly awaiting each new missive. Their connection deepened further during their phone calls. Michael's voice, rough yet reassuring, carried promises of a love unburdened by the weight of her current life. He made her laugh, something she hadn't done in what felt like years. He listened intently, offering her the attention and validation Caleb no longer provided. Slowly but surely, Marcia began to see Michael not as an inmate but as a man who truly understood her. But this new love came with its complications. Marcia was acutely aware of the risks she was taking. A judge having an affair with a convicted felon was a scandal waiting to erupt. Her career, her reputation, even her freedom were on the line. Yet she couldn't bring herself to end it. The pull of Michael's devotion and the thrill of their secrecy proved too intoxicating. Michael's world, however, was far from simple. His connections within the prison ran deep. He was well regarded by a network of inmates and ex-convicts who owed him favors from his time on the outside. Through these connections, Michael had access to a world Marcia couldn't begin to fathom, a world of deals struck in whispers and alliances forged in shadows. It was during one of their calls that Michael first hinted at a solution to Marcia's unhappiness. "You deserve more," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I hate the thought of you wasting your life on someone who doesn't see you." Marcia hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's not that simple, Michael. Caleb, he's not a bad man. But he's not the right man for you," Michael countered. "You deserve someone who'll fight for you, who'll put you first. That's not Caleb. That's me." Michael Grayson, ever resourceful, wasted no time leveraging his connections. He reached out to Marcus "Slim" Dixon, a known enforcer with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. Slim wasn't just a hitman. He was a problem solver for those willing to pay his price. With a string of unsolved murders trailing behind him, Slim operated with the cold precision of a professional. For the right amount of money, he could make anyone disappear. Slim and Michael had a history. Years earlier, they had crossed paths during a short stint in the same penitentiary. Their mutual respect had been born out of shared survival in the harsh prison environment. Slim had since been released, but his connections to the underworld remained intact. When Michael called in his favor, Slim agreed to meet with Marcia, albeit cautiously. For Marcia, the meeting with Slim marked a turning point. Marcia was never one to tell the truth. For Marcia, the meeting with Slim marked a turning point. Up until that moment, her involvement in the plan had been abstract, a series of whispered conversations and coded phone calls. Sitting across from Slim in a dimly lit motel room, the reality of her decision struck her with full force. Slim was a man of few words. His imposing presence, tall, lean, and adorned with tattoos that told a story of violence, did much of the talking for him. He didn't bother with pleasantries, addressing Marcia with a directness that bordered on disdain. "Michael says you've got a problem," he said, lighting a cigarette and exhaling slowly. "You sure you want me to fix it?" Marcia hesitated, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. But the thought of Caleb, his dismissive glances, his cold indifference, steeled her resolve. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Slim nodded, his expression unreadable. "Here's how it works," he said, leaning forward. "I'll handle it my way, on my timeline. No last-minute changes, no backing out. You'll get a call when it's done, half up front, half when it's over. Understood?" Marcia nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. She slid a brown envelope across the table, its contents meticulously prepared. $10,000 in untraceable bills, the first installment of Slim's fee. Slim counted the money without comment, his movements methodical. "I'll need some details," he said after pocketing the cash. "Where he'll be, what his routine is, any security to worry about." Marcia provided the information with chilling detachment. Caleb's work schedule, his usual routes, the places he frequented on his days off. She laid it all out as if reciting a grocery list. She even mentioned Caleb's habit of jogging alone in a secluded park near their home, a vulnerability Slim seized upon immediately. "Jogging route sounds good," he said, stubbing out his cigarette. "Quiet, no witnesses. He got any enemies? Anyone I can pin this on?" Marcia hesitated. Caleb's work as a detective had undoubtedly earned him enemies, but she couldn't bring herself to name specific names. "He's a cop," she said finally. "There's always someone who hates the badge." Slim smirked, a flicker of amusement crossing his otherwise impassive face. "That'll do," he said, rising from his chair. "You'll hear from me soon." The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. Slim disappeared into the night, leaving Marcia alone in the motel room. As she sat in silence, the gravity of her actions began to sink in. She had just hired a man to kill her husband, a man she had once loved, a man who trusted her implicitly. There was no turning back now. Back in prison, Michael awaited updates with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Slim's involvement reassured him, but he couldn't shake the nagging fear that something might go wrong. He and Marcia had gone too far to fail now. For Michael, Caleb's death wasn't just a means to an end. It was a declaration of his love for Marcia, a testament to the lengths he was willing to go for her. Marcia, meanwhile, began the meticulous process of crafting her alibi. She knew the importance of maintaining her facade as a respected judge. Any slip, any indication of involvement could unravel everything. She made a point of attending community events, volunteering for charitable causes, and even rekindling social ties with old friends. To the outside world, she was as composed and dedicated as ever. Caleb, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, continued his routine as usual. The long hours at the precinct, the late-night stakeouts, the occasional jog through the park. His life carried on without disruption. Marcia's behavior, though slightly more attentive than usual, didn't raise any alarms. If anything, Caleb assumed she was trying to mend their strained relationship. As days turned into weeks, Marcia found herself oscillating between panic and anticipation. Every time her phone rang, her heart raced, wondering if it was Slim with news of the hit. At night, she lay awake, replaying their meeting in her mind and second-guessing her decision. But the thought of a future with Michael, free from Caleb's shadow, kept her resolute. But finally the call came. Slim's voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost casual. "It's done," he said. Marcia felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of finality. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now, you wait," Slim replied. "Cops will start sniffing around. You stick to your story, keep your head down, and remember." This never happened. The line went dead before Marcia could respond. She sat in silence, clutching the phone as the weight of Slim's words settled over her. It was over. Caleb was gone. It was a brisk Monday morning when Caleb Hargrove laced up his running shoes, slipped on a light jacket, and set out for his usual jog. The air was crisp, the streets nearly deserted. For Caleb, these runs were more than exercise. They were a form of escape, a way to clear his mind from the weight of his job. The murders, the robberies, the senseless violence he encountered daily as a detective, all of it seemed to melt away with each stride he took. His usual route took him through Ridgewood Park, a sprawling expanse of wooded trails and open fields on the outskirts of Birmingham. At this early hour, the park was tranquil, the only sounds the crunch of his shoes on the gravel path and the occasional chirping of birds. But Caleb wasn't alone. Slim Dixon, hidden among the trees, watched him from a distance. Slim had spent the past week studying Caleb's routine, meticulously planning every detail of the hit. He knew exactly where to position himself, when to strike, and how to leave no trace of his presence. As Caleb jogged deeper into the park, Slim began to move. Dressed in dark clothing and wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, he moved silently, a predator closing in on his prey. In his hand was a pistol, fitted with a suppressor to muffle the shot. The attack was swift. Caleb rounded a bend in the trail, and Slim stepped out from behind a tree, his gun raised. For a brief moment, Caleb froze, his eyes meeting Slim's. There was no time to react, no time to plead or fight. The first shot hit Caleb square in the chest, the impact forcing him to stumble backward. Slim fired twice more, each shot precise and calculated. Caleb collapsed onto the trail, his body motionless. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the gravel and leaves. Slim stood over him for a moment, ensuring the job was done. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the woods, leaving no evidence behind. When Marcia Taylor received the call from Slim later that morning, her first reaction was a mix of relief and dread. "It's done," Slim said, his voice as calm as ever. "Cops will find him soon. You keep your story straight and you'll be fine." Marcia hung up without responding, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. It was over. Caleb was gone. But with his death came a new set of challenges. The investigation would begin soon, and she had to be prepared. She went about her day with careful precision, attending a charity breakfast and meeting with legal colleagues to solidify her alibi. To the outside world, she was the same composed, respected judge she had always been. Inside, however, she was unraveling. Caleb's body was discovered by a jogger later that morning, the gruesome scene sending shockwaves through the community. News of his death spread quickly, and by midday the park was swarming with police officers, detectives, and forensic teams. Detective Paul Rivers, Caleb's longtime partner and closest friend, was among the first to arrive. The sight of Caleb's lifeless body hit him like a gut punch. It was time to go. Paul had seen death countless times in his career, but this was different. This was personal. He crouched beside the body, his eyes scanning the scene for clues. The gunshot wounds were precise, the placement suggesting a professional hit. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than Caleb's on the trail. Whoever did this had planned it meticulously. Paul's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Caleb was a good cop, respected by his colleagues and feared by the criminals he pursued. But he wasn't without enemies. Over the years he had made plenty of them, from drug dealers to gang leaders. Any one of them could have been responsible. The investigation began in earnest, with officers combing the park for evidence. Forensic teams collected bullet casings, analyzed tire tracks near the entrance, and photographed every inch of the crime scene. But despite their efforts, there was little to go on. When Marcia received the call from Paul informing her of Caleb's death, she played her part flawlessly. She gasped, her voice breaking as she asked, "How? How could this happen?" Paul, his own voice heavy with grief, explained the basics. "He was shot during his run. We don't have much yet, but we'll find whoever did this, Marcia, I promise." Marcia's tears came easily, her sobs convincing enough to fool even Paul, who had known her for years. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't deserve this." "No, he didn't," Paul agreed. "But we'll get them. We'll make sure justice is served." After hanging up, Marcia allowed herself a moment to compose. The first hurdle had been cleared. Her performance had been convincing. But the real test was yet to come. The media descended on the story with a frenzy, painting Caleb as a hero and his murder as a tragedy that shook the city. News vans lined the streets near Ridgewood Park, reporters clamoring for statements from police officials and community leaders. Marcia, as the grieving widow, became a central figure in the narrative. She gave a carefully scripted interview to a local news station, her tears flowing as she spoke about Caleb's dedication to his job and his love for their community. "He was a good man," she said, her voice cracking. "He gave everything to this city, and someone took him from us. I just want justice for Caleb." Her performance was lauded as heartfelt and genuine, further cementing her role as a victim in the eyes of the public. But beneath the surface, Marcia was anything but a victim. As the investigation progressed, Paul began piecing together Caleb's final days. He interviewed colleagues, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen Caleb in the days leading up to his death. What he found troubled him. Caleb had mentioned feeling uneasy, as if he were being watched. He had even confided in Paul about receiving anonymous threats, though he had brushed them off as part of the job. Now, those threats seemed far more sinister. Paul also noticed something strange about Marcia. While her grief appeared genuine, there were moments when her composure seemed too controlled, too deliberate. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Paul's mind. By the end of the week, the investigation was at a standstill. There were no leads, no suspects, and no clear motive. Paul, frustrated and determined, vowed to keep digging. For Marcia, the lack of progress was both a relief and a source of anxiety. She had played her part well, but the fear of discovery lingered. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities for the truth to slip out. But for now, she was safe. The plan had worked, and Caleb was gone. What Marcia didn't know, however, was that the cracks in her carefully constructed alibi were already beginning to show. The investigation into Caleb Hargrove's murder officially stalled within weeks of his death. Public pressure began to mount, with citizens demanding answers and justice for the fallen detective. But for Detective Paul Rivers, this case was far from cold. Paul's meticulous review of Caleb's life and work yielded troubling questions. Caleb had been a dedicated cop, but his murder didn't fit the profile of a random act of violence or a simple vendetta. The precision of the hit spoke of professional involvement, and the lack of forensic evidence pointed to someone who had planned every detail. Paul found himself returning to Caleb's conversations in the weeks before his death. Caleb had mentioned his growing unease as though something or someone was shadowing him. But Paul also noticed a peculiar detail in Caleb's behavior. Despite his unease, he never mentioned problems at home. Was Caleb protecting someone, or was he simply unaware of the storm brewing around him? Marcia Taylor, for all her public displays of grief, had begun to draw Paul's suspicion. Though her alibi appeared airtight, her behavior felt rehearsed. She seemed too composed, too controlled in moments when raw emotion should have overwhelmed her. The first crack in her facade appeared when Paul interviewed her again. "Marcia," Paul began, seated across from her in the spacious living room she now occupied alone. "Did Caleb mention anything unusual in the days leading up to his death? Anyone he was worried about?" Marcia shook her head, her expression carefully neutral. No, he didn't. Caleb always kept work separate from home. He didn't want me worrying. Paul studied her face, searching for inconsistencies. What about you? Did you notice anything unusual? Strangers near the house? Odd phone calls? Marcia hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. No, nothing like that, she said, her voice steady. It was a minor hesitation, but Paul caught it. He filed it away, his instincts telling him that Marcia wasn't being entirely truthful. Meanwhile, Paul's investigation uncovered a lead that would alter the course of the case. Through Caleb's phone records, he discovered a series of calls to a disposable number linked to Michael Grayson, an inmate in Alabama State Penitentiary. At first, the connection seemed tenuous. Why would Caleb, a decorated detective, be in contact with a convicted felon? But further digging revealed the truth. The calls weren't coming from Caleb. They were coming from Marcia. Paul's discovery sent a chill down his spine. Marcia, the grieving widow, had been in contact with a dangerous criminal. The revelation opened a new avenue of investigation, one that led directly to Michael Grayson. Michael, despite being behind bars, was not hard to locate. Under the guise of a routine inquiry, Paul arranged an interview with him. "Grayson," Paul said, sitting across from him in the stark interrogation room. "You've been receiving calls from Judge Marcia Taylor. Care to explain why?" Michael smirked, his demeanor cocky and unrepentant. "Marcia? She's just a friend," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Happy birthday," she said, leaning back in his chair. "This has been helping me turn my life around." "Isn't that what judges are supposed to do?" Paul's eyes narrowed. "Helping you? By what, discussing her husband's murder?" The smirk faltered, but Michael quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective," he said smoothly. "I had nothing to do with Caleb's death." But Paul wasn't convinced. The link between Michael and Marcia was too strong to ignore, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The mounting evidence against Marcia and Michael culminated in a dramatic turn of events. With a warrant in hand, Paul and his team searched Marcia's home, uncovering hidden financial transactions that linked her to Marcus "Slim" Dixon. The discovery was damning. Records showed that Marcia had withdrawn large sums of cash in the weeks leading up to Caleb's murder. Money that was traced to Slim through a series of anonymous exchanges. Confronted with the evidence, Marcia maintained her innocence. "I don't know anything about this," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Those transactions have nothing to do with Caleb's death." But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Marcia was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, her once esteemed reputation in shambles. So, the trial of Marcia Taylor became a media spectacle, with every detail of her affair with Michael Grayson and her alleged involvement in Caleb's murder laid bare for public consumption. Prosecutors painted a damning picture of Marcia as a woman consumed by passion and greed, willing to sacrifice her husband to be with her lover. They presented evidence of her financial transactions, phone records, and Slim Dixon's testimony, which revealed the extent of her role in orchestrating Caleb's murder. Marcia's defense team argued that she had been manipulated by Michael, who they claimed had masterminded the entire plot. But the jury was not swayed. The evidence was too overwhelming, the betrayal too egregious. In the end, Marcia Taylor was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Grayson, for his role in the plot, received an additional 25 years to his sentence, ensuring that he would never see the outside world again. Slim Dixon, in exchange for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence but remained a key figure in the prosecution's case. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Caleb's family and friends, but the scars of his murder lingered. Paul Rivers, who had pursued the case with relentless determination, found himself haunted by the betrayal that had led to his partner's death. The case of Judge Marcia Taylor became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how ambition and passion can lead even the most respected individuals down a path of destruction. In prison, Marcia faced the harsh reality of her choices. Stripped of her power and status, she was no longer the formidable judge who commanded respect in the courtroom. Instead, she was just another inmate, serving time for a crime that had shattered lives, including her own. For the city of Birmingham, the trial marked the end of a dark chapter, but its lessons endured. The memory of Caleb Hargrove, a dedicated detective who had given his life in service of justice, remained a poignant reminder of the cost of betrayal. Paul Rivers, though deeply affected by the case, continued his work, driven by the belief that justice must prevail, even when it comes at a heavy price. If you enjoyed this dive into the mystery, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime OCS for more chilling stories from history's darkest corners. Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Let's untangle the truth together. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.